It's a huge and honestly a really tough question that people have been asking for well over a century. Why did a civilization that was once the absolute forefront of science, culture, and thought seem to fall behind? Today, we're going to dig into that using the analysis from Dr. Özgar KANBİR as our guide. Okay, so to get why this question is still so incredibly relevant, let's just look at the numbers from today. Right now, the countries in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation make up about a quarter of the entire world's population, a full 25%. But they generate just over 8% of the world's GDP. That huge gap is kind of the modern day echo of the historical question we're looking at. So, where do you even start with a question this big? Well, the analysis we're following breaks it down in a really helpful way. It splits the causes into two big buckets: factors that came from inside the civilization, a kind of collapse from within, and then the massive pressures that came from the outside. So here's our game plan. First, we'll set the stage and talk about why this is such an enduring question. Then, we'll dive deep into those internal factors that created some real vulnerabilities. After that, we'll look at the external shocks that hit the Islamic world. And finally, we'll tie it all together to see how these two things created a really tragic cycle. Right, so first off, let's just appreciate that this is not some new debate. This isn't something that just popped up recently. It's a deep, soul-searching conversation that's been going on for centuries, really, by thinkers from all over. And it's driven by this really sharp and, let's be honest, often painful contrast between a truly brilliant past and a much more challenging present. Okay, so let's get into the first part of this thesis, this idea of a collapse from within. The argument here is that before things got really bad from outside pressures, something was already changing deep inside the intellectual and social fabric of Muslim societies. And at the heart of this big internal shift was this fundamental battle of ideas. You had on one side the rationalists. They were all about using logic, reason, and being flexible. On the other side, you had the traditionalists, who really emphasized more literal interpretation of texts, a certain fatalism, and sticking rigidly to tradition. And what happened over a few centuries is that the scales started to tip. The analysis here suggests that as societies became more land-based, more kind of feudal, that traditionalist school of thought just fit better. Its focus on authority and rigidity mirrored the way society was structured, and it eventually became the dominant way of thinking. Now, a major casualty in this whole intellectual fight was this concept of ijtihad. You gotta understand, this was like the engine of the Islamic Golden Age. It was the principle of using your own reasoning to apply timeless ideas to new problems. It was the very thing that made the tradition so dynamic and allowed it to adapt to a changing world. And the impact of losing that engine? It was massive. The author points to the famous scholar Edward Said, who didn't pull any punches at all. He called the decline of ijtihad a cultural disaster. It was like slamming the door on critical thinking and adaptation. This shift wasn't just happening in the libraries and courts. It was happening spiritually too. The analysis shows a change in the kind of Sufism that became popular. An earlier, more active version saw hard work and contributing to the world as a form of spiritual practice. But that slowly gave way to a more passive, inward-looking version that focused on detaching from worldly things, which kind of naturally pushed economic and scientific progress to the side. So you put all that together, the win for literalism, the loss of independent reasoning, a spiritual life that turned away from the material world, what do you get? Well, you get a whole societal mindset, a mindset that became resistant to new ideas, that wasn't very curious, and that just didn't have that same dynamic spark that had made the civilization a world leader. But here's the thing, this internal weakening didn't happen in a bubble. It's one thing for a society to become rigid and inward-looking, but what happens when that same society then gets hit by one devastating blow after another from the outside? Well, that's the second part of the story. And man, when you look at the timeline, it is just relentless, a centuries-long barrage. The Crusades started a long, draining period of war. Then came the Mongols, who just shattered the cultural heartland. The loss of Spain cut off a vital connection to Europe. And then, as if all that wasn't enough, European explorers found new sea routes that completely bypassed the Muslim world's trade networks, basically strangling their economies. Of all those events, the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 was just a catastrophe on another level. This wasn't just a battle, it was the destruction of a culture. That story you hear about the Tigris River running black from the ink of all the books thrown into it, it's just this incredibly powerful symbol of how much knowledge, how much history was just wiped out. And right in the middle of all this chaos, a new power was rising in the West. Europe was getting organized, becoming incredibly competitive, and was starting to expand globally, funded by colonialism. The Muslim world, already weakened and broken up, was just caught completely off guard. And then the colonial powers came in and literally redrew the map, creating artificial countries and divisions that, we're still dealing with today. So this is where it all comes together. The really crucial point isn't about blaming one thing or the other. It's not just internal decay, and it's not just external attacks. The real tragedy is how these two things got locked together in a vicious cycle. And there it is, the core argument in a nutshell. The internal shift away from reason and dynamism, it made the civilization brittle. So when those huge hammer blows from the outside started to fall, the invasions, the economic shifts, that brittle structure couldn't bend. It just shattered. The internal weakness made the external shocks 1,000 times worse. This quote from Gustav Mahler that the author brings in, wow, it just nails the whole problem. The analysis is basically saying that in trying to protect tradition, the dominant mindset started worshiping the ashes of the past instead of tending to the living fire of reason and adaptation that had made it so great in the first place. And so, in the end, Dr. Conver's analysis makes this really important distinction. It's not about the core tenets of the faith itself. The argument is that the problem was with the human interpretations that took hold over time, interpretations that shut down that dynamism. The way forward, then, isn't to reject your heritage, but to go back and rediscover the rational, adaptive spirit that fueled its own golden age. And that leaves us with a huge question. And it's a question for everybody, not just one civilization. We've seen how a culture can lose its way by holding on too tight to the past. So in our own crazy, fast-changing world, it makes you ask, how does any society strike that balance? How do we all learn to preserve that living fire of our heritage without getting lost just worshiping the ashes?